Warning, this video deals with mature content and contains graphic material which may be disturbing and or triggering to some audience members. Viewer discretion is strongly advised.
It's like we have no idea what we are. If we all closed our eyes, we would just be like in a dimension.
Self-enucleation, also known as autoenucleation or Oedipism, is the act of removing one's own eyeballs. It is one of the extremely rare forms of self-mutilation. Cases of self-enucleation are usually augmented or bolstered by a mental illness, such as bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, and or by substance abuse. Today specifically, you're about to hear one woman's terrifying yet true tale, and the details which propelled her down the dark and twisted road that would inevitably result in her own self-enucleation. Ladies and gentlemen, on that note, if you wish to proceed, then it is without any further ado that I now present to you the tragic true story of Tanya Suarez.
We're learning some chilling details about a new lawsuit against the county of San Diego. A San Diego State student claims cameras rolled, but no help came as she disfigured her own face while high on methamphetamine at Las Colinas jail.
10 News reporter Cassie Carlisle.
So I must go. Been broken.
As her numerous YouTube uploads will attest, less than a half a year prior to the tragic event that would change her life forever, Tanya Suarez was just like any other energetic, fun-loving college kid who had her whole life to look forward to.
I'm so excited about this channel. Like, you have no idea.
She is without a doubt quite striking, and yet the more they continue to watch, the more a viewer realizes there's a lot more to Tanya than first meets the eye. Throughout the course of several dozens of videos, spanning approximately 10 months, Tanya expresses a side of herself that is passionate, quirky, and even vulnerable at times. Over time, one may even start to feel a certain connection to the spunky 20-something psychology major from San Diego. She's relatable after all, she's expressive, forward-thinking, and she's quick to laugh and smile. Yet by the same token, there are times we catch glimpses of another side of Tanya, one that is more quiet and contemplative. She's often introspective, perhaps even ruminative, and at times she even seems troubled by apprehension and self-doubt.
Like I have become this way. Like, I feel just because I think it's just because like lack of friendship.
She often speaks candidly on her longing to understand herself, and her longing to be accepted by the rest of the world, just as the person she is. One thing is certain, and that's that Tanya Suarez appears to wear her emotions on her sleeve. Perhaps one of Tanya's most endearing traits is, after all, her openness, her honesty. Or the way how, regardless of what mood may be eclipsing her at the moment, Tanya remains unapologetically herself. Many of us surely can't help but wonder what could possibly drive such a seemingly good-natured, fun-loving, beautiful young woman to remove her own eyes. Ultimately, if we aim to truly understand who she is now, it reasons that we must understand where she has been. Unbeknownst to anyone at the time of her last YouTube upload in December 2017, it would not be long before Tanya's life would begin to veer rather rapidly off course. Feeling overwhelmed by her studies, Tanya would drop out of college only 7 credits short of graduating with her bachelor's degree in psychology.
Like, out of fear of these things, out of fear of people thinking I'm crazy and then me getting kicked out of the university. That's like one of my biggest fears. But like, the more I think about it, like the more I know that that's not gonna happen.
She would also be briefly hospitalized following an attempted suicide.
The worst thing that could happen is I end up in a mental hospital, and that would be the worst thing ever.
And as if this weren't enough, she would also be kicked out of her parents' home after they discovered her smoking pot. And yet this was barely just the beginning of this seemingly unlucky chain of misfortune that would strike Tanya's life. Taken from a variety of articles, interviews, and court documents, here's a piecing together of what unraveled on one fateful day in May. One might actually say her ordeal was set into motion on the evening of May 5th, 2018. On this night, Tanya recalls she would accompany her boyfriend to a hotel room where a group of new friends had gathered to party. To this particular crowd, partying meant in part the consumption of drugs, hard drugs not being exempt. In the media, methamphetamine has been popularly called out as the sole culprit in the horror that soon would wreak havoc within Tanya's mind. Yet one look at the side effects Tanya would experience, and it raises the question of whether the meth had an accomplice. By the wee hours of May 6th, Tanya would have reached such a state of delusional and paranoid psychosis that it's highly unlikely for the meth to have acted 100% alone. One thing that in all likelihood holds some relevancy to this case is the fact that Tanya had been previously diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And by Tanya's own admission, she had been neglecting to take her antipsychotic medications at the time. It is natural, therefore, that some degree of speculation also surrounds the question of what role did Tanya's illness play in this matter, if any. It is a question worth debating, but it is probably best left as the topic of another discussion, because in the end, all that matters here is that whatever happened on that night, it would soon have Tanya thrown into such a grossly irrational state that, within a matter of hours, it would incite her to perform the unthinkable. As she would relate to NBC's Catherine Garcia, on that day, at that time, she was feeling extremely paranoid due to the drugs. Delusions which would eventually come to mimic a full-blown psychotic episode began to flood Tanya's mind as she sat and observed her surroundings in that hotel room. She admits she doesn't know whether this was real or imagined, but she describes how a strange unknown man had come into the room, bringing with him in tow a suitcase full of small knives. This was enough to spook Tanya to the core. She describes a feeling of unease that triggered her to take off running from the hotel room with such an urgency that she even left behind her cell phone and her shoes. Where was she headed? In her confused and frightened state, even Tanya didn't really know. All she knew was that she needed to escape to safety, and at that moment, this meant getting as far away from that hotel room as possible. And so for an approximated 2 hours, Tanya walked alone in the dark, barefoot, and without a means of calling anyone for help, had she been of a mind to do so. It was with her delusional thinking peddling her along that she recalls the sudden urge to run in front of traffic, so as to end her own life. Luckily, that was a fleeting consideration she ultimately didn't follow through with. Instead, Tanya would eventually find herself in a gas station parking lot, where at about 1 a.m., a patrol car would roll up, and Tanya would be arrested for being under the influence of drugs. Tanya would subsequently be brought into the Colinas Detention and Retention Facility for women. Now it's here at this point where in most cases we would presume Tanya's story and her ordeal to have come to an end. Perhaps following a night in the drunk tank, newly sobered up Tanya would be sent home with a pair of jail slippers and an upcoming court date. This is arguably how it should have gone. But yet, nobody would have guessed it at the time. Tanya's real nightmare had still yet to even expose the tip of its head. In fact, it wouldn't be until after she was brought into custody that the true horror story would start to unravel. Once in police custody, Tanya's psychotic delusions would continue wreaking havoc on her conscious awareness, her worst fears being amplified by the sights and sounds of all that was going on around her. Already paranoid, all it took for a warped idea to plant itself firmly in her head was for Tanya to overhear another random woman shouting, "My eyes, my eyes." And suddenly, the fuse had been lit. Hearing the woman scream about her eyes in that moment, Tanya's delusional mind rationalized that the police were working in tandem with drug cartels, that their plan was to torture her, starting with the removal of her eyes. Tanya would further rationalize that in order to avoid the extensive and painful torture that the police were planning to inflict, the best thing to do would be to beat the police to it. Furthermore, it only made sense she would need to act quickly. Thus, when she was taken in for fingerprinting, which was the very first time they'd removed her handcuffs since she'd been arrested, Tanya seized the opportunity to use her fingernails to begin an aggressive attack on her own eyes. The police had to forcibly restrain her before she would stop. They tackled her onto the floor. Then, in seeing her long nails as a potential continuing threat, officers threw Tanya face down onto a gurney and restrained her hands behind her back. Then they proceeded to cut off her fingernails. However, as actual photographs show, they did an extremely crude job. This left her acrylic nails in a severely torn and jagged state. Arguably, this made them even more weapon-like than before. Nonetheless, with the exception of this incident, deputies would carry on with what they otherwise treated as any other routine intake process. It's another part of this process that would later become highly relevant to Tanya's case. Specifically, before being placed inside a cell, Tanya would undergo a Q&A of sorts with an intake nurse who was acting at the time in the role of what the jail calls their gatekeeper. The role of the designated gatekeeper at any given time is that this person closely follows a specific set of rules, a certain safety protocol, which is spelled out by the detention facility. This protocol is specifically designed to look out for those in custody and to make the inmate's safety a priority among jail personnel. Following their session, RN Shannon Keene, who was acting in the role of designated gatekeeper at the time, would issue orders for Tanya to be placed into a solitary suicide or safety cell. Yet upon being brought into the safety cell, prior to leaving her alone and locking the door behind them, deputies would remove Tanya's restraints, leaving her alone with her hands free. Fast forwarding again to 2 years later, and Tanya would file a motion to sue the jail and jail officials. The motion specifically calls into question the actions and decisions of the aforementioned gatekeeper, registered nurse Shannon Keene. The complaint alleges specifically that Tanya, quote, is now permanently blind as the result of the defendant's callous and indifferent behavior, end quote. It is alleged that Keene specifically had grossly neglected to follow the proper protocol, which would have been applicable to follow in Tanya's case. Tanya's lawyer argues that adherence to the protocol would have saved Tanya's eyesight. Because back to the wee morning hours of May 6th, Miss Suarez, sitting alone in her safety cell, yet still undergoing mass delusions, would not hesitate to resume the attack on her own eyes in an effort to complete the job she had started before. Tanya later states that after being thrust into her cell and left there alone, she had looked up, at first noticing the security camera in the corner. Then Tanya's gaze panned over, and she recalls looking over to the cell's window, where she saw, rather chillingly, a woman dressed in a deputy's uniform standing there and recording her with an iPhone. Tanya insists that the woman was real and not a hallucination. That is one of the last things Tanya remembers seeing before deciding to finish what she'd previously set out to accomplish. Once again, in finding herself housed alone, with her arms and hands free, and with her fingernails now serving as the perfect tool, it would take Tanya a mere 30 seconds to remove her right eyeball, then another 4 minutes to remove her left one. She recalls the darkness that would accompany this act, but by her own account, she recalls feeling mostly relief at having fulfilled her mission. And astonishingly, it was not for another 5 to 10 minutes after that a deputy would finally enter her cell. This in spite of the fact it is said that Tanya could be observed over the surveillance video, screaming and flailing wildly around her cell while her self-enucleation was taking place. Nonetheless, after the gruesome scene had at last been stumbled upon, Tanya would be transported to a hospital where, unfortunately, everyone would learn that Tanya had been too thorough for her own good. Her eyesight could not be salvaged, and the seemingly irrepressible bouncy ball of energy Tanya Suarez, not yet having lived to see her mid-20s, would never see again. As the lawsuit even mentions, Tanya, who had been too frightened to sleep with the lights off even as an adult, was now sentenced to live out the rest of her life in perpetual darkness. All in all, what is actually at the crux of this case is not Tanya's drug binge, it's not her depression or bipolar disorder, it isn't her delusions, it's not even the act of her gouging out her own eyes, so much as it is what the police did to prevent this or to stop her as it was happening. Or rather, it's about what they didn't do. Recall yet again that Tanya had been left in a safety cell and left unrestrained. And as Tanya sat alone in her cell, undergoing these massive delusions and clawing at her own eyes to the point she succeeded in entirely removing them from their sockets, the prison guards were nowhere to be found. Tanya's lawsuit alleges that the department severely dropped the ball. They did nothing to stop her, and they'd taken no precautions to protect her. By cutting her nails in the manner they had, reflecting on the shoddy job and deciding not to clean it up a little, they likely made the victim's job even easier in the end. Then additionally, if one deems the deputy Tanya spotted at her window to have been real, it only begs a question as to whether Tanya may have purposely and maliciously been denied of the assistance she needed. These are, in a nutshell, Tanya's complaints against RN Keene and the San Diego County Sheriff's Department. Perhaps interesting to note is that Tanya's lawsuit was one of 3 lawsuits filed against the same department on that very same day. In Tanya's case, it is argued that it is not for lack of knowledge that Keene botched her duties as gatekeeper. One look at Keene's notes, and it would appear that there was little to no ambiguity as to Tanya's state at the time. To wit, Keene had taken note that, quote-unquote, Tanya was still responding to internal stimuli at that time. Or in other words, Keene was fully aware that Tanya was being provoked by delusional thoughts of a menacing nature. Tanya had also been forthcoming with Keene about her drug consumption, her desire to self-harm, as well as the fact that she was off of her antipsychotics prescribed to treat her bipolar disorder. It is also presumed that Keene had awareness that, during fingerprinting, Tanya had viciously attacked her eyeball with her bare hands, and that she had only stopped because officers had intervened. Protocol in such an instance would have required that Tanya be placed in a solitary cell, albeit with her restraints still on. This is not an arbitrary rule. Rather, it is part of a clearly spelled out procedure officials are mandated by the department to abide by. The removal of her restraints, it is argued, is what helped to seal Tanya's fate. And with Tanya's obviously diminished capacity to distinguish delusion from reality, it was incumbent upon both Keene and other jail officials to see to it that the protocol was upheld in order to ensure Tanya's safety. As it is alleged by Tanya's attorney, Tanya's self-enucleation was in fact observed as it was taking place, and yet nobody attempted to intervene nor call for assistance in any way. We furthermore can't help but ask the question, if the defendants argue that Tanya's acts were not foreseeable, a statement along the lines of which the Sheriff's Department did issue relatively early on, then why had they seen the need to cut Tanya's nails? The fact that they cut her nails alone should speak in support of their existing a belief that Tanya further posed a danger to herself absolutely. Tanya herself expresses remorse over the situation, stating that she wishes they'd simply in the very least just sat with her and explained to her that her delusions were not real and that they would pass. Since the initial filing back in March of last year, 2020, motions have continued between the plaintiff and defendant, and from all that is known to me at least, justice in the matter still pens. Following her whole harrowing incident, Tanya remained in a hospital for a couple of months, a stint which Tanya likens to hell on earth, and upon discharge she was welcomed back into her parents' home. Even though Tanya is striving to remain optimistic, life has not shockingly become far more difficult for her. Her own lawsuit even states that now, for example, she's constantly bumping into things around the house, or spilling food on herself when attempting to eat. In summary, it is now with great difficulty that she completes even the most mundane of chores, things which the most of us has learned to take for granted. Tanya now is forced to rely on other people for almost everything. This indeed must be quite a difficult transition for the old Tanya Suarez, who appeared to cherish the moments of her life in which she was permitted to assert her independence. During their conversation, Tanya admits to Garcia that, while she has no choice but to accept her newfound situation, she still hasn't fully come to terms with it. And yet, nonetheless, Tanya continues the battle. She now wears prosthetic eyeballs, and despite living a more difficult life, she continues to pursue activities which she hopes will nurture her in practice as well as spiritually. She has, for example, learned to play a little bit of the piano. She also continues to learn to read Braille, and even considers returning to San Diego State to finish her classes. When all is said and done, in the case of Tanya Suarez, I hope that I am safe in assuming that we all wish the best for Tanya from here forward.
My real dream, or one of my real dreams, is to be a star. It's to be a star.
As far as this particular case is concerned, I would have to say that there's one pretty major update, and that is with regard to the lawsuit that was mentioned, which Tanya had filed against San Diego County and a certain individual named Shannon Keene, who, if you recall, was on staff at the jail the night that Tanya was there. Well, news since the original taping is that in the case of Tanya versus the County of San Diego and Shannon Keene, Tanya agreed to let the case settle for a payout of $4.35 million. I imagine this has to feel just slightly bittersweet, but from a general standpoint, it does come across as a victory, because as I've come to learn throughout the course of following this story, Tanya Suarez's case may not be the freak occurrence that a lot of people out there might think it to be. As it turns out, corruption in San Diego's jails and law enforcement has become somewhat rampant. Check out a couple of these quick clips.
Unsanitary facilities, a lack of medical and mental health care, and people dying behind bars at alarming rates. Those are the concerns the ACLU says it has for people in custody of the San Diego County Sheriff's Department.
The 126-page report digs into why 185 inmates have died in custody between 2006 and 2021. The report's main finding at the jails is a, quote, failure to consistently provide adequate medical and mental health care from the moment inmates come in. The ACLU is trying to take the Sheriff's Department to court with a class action lawsuit.
On November 11, 2019, 24-year-old Elisa Serna died while in custody at the Las Colinas detention facility.
Dana Lee Pasqua has been charged with involuntary manslaughter. Prosecutors say she left an inmate having seizures on the floor of her cell for nearly an hour. The Diego family is searching for answers tonight into how their 22-year-old son died in a San Diego jail. New developments tonight in the death of an inmate at Las Colinas 3 years ago.
Criminal charges have been brought by the DA's office against a doctor who was on duty when the young woman died.
The family of a man who died at the San Diego Central Jail earlier this week is demanding answers. They are saying they don't believe the Sheriff's Department's claims that Jarrell Lacey died of natural causes.
This video given to Team 10 was taken in what's known as the Sally Port at San Diego Central Jail. The video shows San Diego County deputies dishing out the body blows. The man taking them, Joshua Strode.
Says, put your hands behind your back. I say, I can't. My clavicle is broken, and before he could even finish that sentence, next thing you know, it's just violence.
Strode and his attorney filed a claim with the county for damages.
It seems pretty undeniable that something is definitely going on down there, but we'll touch on that just a little bit more in a second. I first have a couple of things I came across with regards to Tanya's case that I thought were rather interesting. Going back, if you recall, Tanya was picked up by law enforcement on May 6, 2019 at a gas station in the middle of the night. She was feeling extremely delusional. She didn't know fantasy from reality. She even begged the cops to shoot her, it said. So the cops, not being able to help but notice that she wasn't acting normal, they basically took her in on charges of being under the influence of a controlled substance. Fair enough. It's during fingerprinting, just roughly a little after 4:30 a.m., that Tanya, in response to these delusions, first starts attacking one of her eyes. And of course, the video already explains where Tanya's mind was at this point, so we won't go into any of that again. What we do need to take note of is that at this time, deputies are able to quickly intervene before Tanya can actually damage herself. More specifically, it's said that they tackle her, cuff her, secure her face down on a gurney, and rather recklessly cut her nails. At this point, she's thrown into the cell naked and also unrestrained. And we all know what happens next, of course. It's at this juncture at which Tanya starts screaming bloody murder while she proceeds to attack her eyes again. Now, if you recall, there's one point where Tanya's in this cell and she reports looking up at the window and she can see one of the guards or deputies or whatever, and they're standing there filming her with a cell phone. This was mentioned in the video, but I refrained from putting too much emphasis on it back then for the fact that even though Tanya had sworn this was real and not a hallucination, you still have your reservations a little bit just knowing how delusional she was at the time. Well, here's an update of sorts on that. As it would come out in court, Tanya was right. What she saw was not a hallucination. There actually really was a deputy guard or what have you standing there and filming Tanya on her iPhone as Tanya sat there in agony, naked, bloody, screaming, and basically in the process of irreversibly blinding herself for life. For at least 5 minutes, it said that this person recorded this all for posterity and yet made not one move to get Tanya any help or much less to stop the enucleation from taking place. What did this person plan to do with this video? Seriously? This person could have made the difference between Tanya being forever blind or not being blind. And this person is that much of a psychopath. They just stood there. This is a person who has the power to arrest you and me were we to cross this individual's path. Can you imagine such a sadistic psychopath being granted that kind of power? I guess with that said, there's just one more thing about this case that came up that I wanted to share, and it goes back yet again to defendant Shannon Keene. As we know, Keene was the one responsible for ensuring that Tanya would not be placed anywhere without restraints. She was duty-bound to ensure that Tanya was not left in a state where she would be able to hurt herself, and in this particular case, it was the fact that her restraints were removed that left Tanya in harm's way. Or as Daniel Pena, one of the attorneys representing Tanya, put it, quote, "When you arrest someone and you incarcerate them, they are in your care and custody. And if they were given some foreseeable notice that Ms. Suarez was going to harm herself, they had the responsibility to intervene. The county was hit with a $4.3 million settlement because they knew Suarez was going to inflict harm on her eyesight, and they let her do it," end quote. To quote from the complaint or the lawsuit itself, Quote, defendant Keene was the designated gatekeeper on duty. Doe deputy defendants escorted Tanya to defendant Keene for evaluation and assessment. Doe deputy defendants informed defendant Keene of Tanya's self-harming behavior. Tanya told defendant Keene that she was bipolar and not currently on medication, and that she had been using a controlled substance and was experiencing paranoid delusions. Defendant Keene also knew that Tanya was recently hospitalized on a 5150 for suicidal ideations. End quote. From all I've seen, Tanya wanted help. And in the end, Keene had all the information she needed to know which protocol needed to be followed. The protocol is like 4 steps. And did she follow it? No. Once again, quote, if an inmate is actively engaging in self-harm, the gatekeeper is to place the inmate on the ISP, Inmate Safety Plan Program. The inmate is to be assigned to a safety cell with restraints and scheduled for a psychiatric evaluation immediately. Defendant Keene failed to recognize Tanya as a risk of self-harm. Rather, defendant Keene performed a medical assessment of Tanya's eye. Defendant Keene placed Tanya in a safety cell, but first removed the handcuffs. End quote. Just FYI, I do like to give people the benefit of the doubt. Maybe that's a weakness, but I always do hope that there's an alternative explanation to someone just being mean. And for me, it's no different with Shannon Keene. Reading all the accusations against her, I had wanted to hope that, maybe Shannon Keene isn't actually a bad person. Maybe she's just really that stupid, and maybe she didn't know what she was doing. But wait, it turns out that Keene may have messed up even worse than we originally thought. First of all, following that concerning close call during fingerprinting, Keene straight out ignores a recommendation from another unnamed deputy that she perhaps try putting Tanya in something called a prostrate chair. I'm not familiar with this device myself, but I get the gist that had this been utilized, Tanya would not have been able to hurt herself or do what she ended up doing. So, as it turns out, Keene also subsequently made sure to alter documents in order to get rid of anything that made any mention of this recommendation. Shannon Keene instructs everyone to more or less destroy any evidence, anything they might have written in any of their reports or anything, which mentions the deputy's recommendation, and also she says to destroy everything and anything which mentions her decision not to utilize restraints. A very deliberate cover-up, in other words. Like the video briefly mentioned, Tanya was only one of many lawsuits filed against the county around that time. 2 or 3 others, I believed, had been filed on that very same day. Daniel Pena adds that, quote, the county of San Diego and its jail system is in crisis mode. It has been for the last 7 years. They are making policy adjustments, but the people that they have operating those jails need to go. This is going to continue until the county decides to remove these bad actors from operating our jails, end quote. It's not a bad point to end on, especially since I see this being increasingly more the case in various stories I encounter. A lot of times, people don't get fired. I suppose it's just assumed that the agent in question just needs better training. In a case where training is remedial or worse, a form of punishment, when you're already that type of person that thinks you're being wrongfully blamed and you already know how to do your job better than anybody else, and that the notion that you need training is just absurd considering you could probably teach that training class yourself. Well, how well do you think this hypothetical individual is going to perform in the training? Ultimately, a lot of times the problem is when you've got, for lack of better terms, a sociopath or a sadist working in the department. You can throw all the extra training at them you want. It still will never change them or teach them how to be a good person or how to care about other human beings. It may sound simple, but apparently a lot of people don't get it. Unfortunately, this specific line of work is a magnet for individuals who seek an outlet by which to exercise control over others or bully others, etc. I'm not saying that every cop is this way, just like every department store Santa isn't going to be a child predator. There are good cops out there, but all I'm saying is that if you're someone who likes little children, you're probably going to prefer to get a job that makes little children accessible to you over a job that doesn't. Similarly, if you're a person who takes pleasure out of, like I said, bullying people, degrading people, and demeaning them, a job that allows you to do that with impunity, and there are not many of them, is a job you're going to prefer over others. Well, we've got to wonder, is this the case in San Diego? What do you think is going on down there? Feel free to comment down below. Please be respectful to everybody. In conclusion, the last time I heard any sort of update about Tanya herself was roughly about a year ago, maybe a little bit less, but what I was able to learn is that Tanya does continue to adjust to her new life. You could say, by the looks of it, she seems to have a good support system in place, namely when it comes to her family and especially her twin sister Xenia. I don't know much more, and to be honest, now that the public aspect of the story, i.e. the lawsuit, has been settled, I feel like it's only right to give their family all a bit of privacy from here on out. But there is just one thing that I want to share because it made me really happy to see it, and that is I actually saw that Tanya is still dancing. And I mean after the fact, naturally. This made me just really happy to see, for the fact that you can really tell that it was one of those things that she enjoyed probably the most. And just to see that it's something that she still has the drive and the passion to keep doing even now, it simply points to how far she's come and how strong a person she really is. And it also gives me a little more peace of mind in thinking that maybe she is doing better, even if it's maybe going to be a process of just taking it day by day.